It felt you wrote, is it'll be high. 1,000 welcomes to the Village Oak Tree for May 1st, 2024. I'm your host, Terrence O'Donnell. I'm returning to your village again with another commentary on world affairs since the interview I had mentioned I would have for you last week had to be postponed until next week. For those who have been regular listeners, I've been running a series about the game of empires as related to the United States and the West. This week, I have another segment to add to the list. I want to start off with a bit of a history lesson, an alternative one from what is typically taught in most U.S. classrooms, even when I was a kid. Let's start from the very beginning of the colonization of North America. In the late 16th century, the only Europeans in North America were the Spaniards, who had started to colonize what is now known as the Florida Peninsula, setting up a colony in St. Augustine and a couple other small places around Key West. The French had also been busy up north in what is now the Canadian Maritimes. Not a lot of traffic yet, but the word was out in Europe. Then came the Puritans. They were being thrown out of England and Europe for their extreme religious beliefs and told to go anywhere but go. They had heard of the New World that was just opening up and contracted some ship's captains to take them to Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts. This has been a theme from the beginning. Extreme Christian religious groups running from the authorities, ending up somewhere where no one could tell them how to practice their brand of religion. Bad things usually happen eventually, ending up in huge losses of life. Even back then, these religious zealots couldn't get along with anybody and used North America as a big open land to run away from whoever was picking on them. In the next 150 years, the floodgates were open and the colonists started pouring in from all over, settling all up and down the North American East Coast. All the land was, at first, given to their English landowners who were empowered to create plantations and businesses in order to keep the proceeds flowing back to England. As I mentioned before, the first slaves appeared in 1621 in Virginia via an English privateer needing supplies, so they could go back down to the Caribbean to continue robbing more Spanish gold ships and so on. For the pirates supported by the British government, that's where the money was. Meanwhile, the idea caught on, and more ships started delivering this free labor commodity. During all this expansion, the British defeated the French and the Spanish in the 18th century and grabbed all their New World territories any way they could, forcing them or incorporating them all eventually by the middle of the 19th century. During this idea of free land for the taking, promoted by the English government, the colonists, tired of being persecuted by the rich elites in the colonies in Europe, kept moving west across the new continent, always on the run from a government authority, whether it was a colonial governor with his British troops, or a local town mayor who was a bit too authoritarian, or maybe some other kind of authority. As soon as the town was set up and someone stepped in to become the authority, these unhappy souls would pick up and continue west, always looking for that myth of ultimate freedom to do as they wished. Along the way, they died by thousands and attempted to commit ethnic cleansing of any others that got in the way, notably the first Americans and the Spaniards who were left behind when Spain pulled out and went back to Mexico after the Texas War in the 1830s. The people of the new United States went to war with each other and everyone else during the 19th century. More historical evidence that these disparate tribes from Europe would never learn to get along with each other for very long. Too many different tribal affiliations that caused tempers to fly when they couldn't have their own way. The polarization between the religious factions, the rich and the poor, the different tribes of Europeans have never stopped, except for maybe once in the short history of the United States, World War II. They all came together, mostly, and worked hard collectively to defeat the Axis powers. The U.S. had a charismatic leader back then, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he rallied everyone to push the Japanese and the Germans back to where they came from, but at great cost. Millions of soldiers, millions of people. Then Truman took the mantle and introduced the world to atomic bombs. Big mistake. Millions of people dead from World War II, way beyond the millions of soldiers killed in battle. Whole countries upended and destroyed, and life as the world knew it was dramatically changed forever. In the US, a new phenomenon was discovered during the years after Pearl Harbor: defense contracts. The rich corporations were rerouted into manufacturing everything for the war effort. FDR nationalized them, but they got paid for all their work with war bonds and other borrowed money. And they developed a strong taste for that market. There was potential for a lot of money to be made. After the war in Europe and the Pacific died down, defense contractors got together and found a new market for all the leftover war surplus they now found themselves with. More little wars were cropping up around the world as new territorial boundaries were being carved out of the rubble in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East. These enterprising Americans rubbed their hands together with glee and sent their salesmen out to the world to sell military surplus. Since humans are notoriously greedy creatures, these descendants of the Europeans started flooding countries around the world with arms and equipment that a lot of undeveloped countries had never seen before. They had mineral wealth or agriculture worth something to pay with, so off to the arms races the world went, supplied by the United States. It didn't take long for the greedy politicians in the US to see what was going on and demand a share for their favorable legislation. Then the rancor with Stalin in Russia took off. Russia liked being part of the big boy club during World War II and wanted that to continue, while still murdering millions and locking up even more in gulags. The US, now being hailed as the savior of the world for leading to the defeat of the Axis powers, was riding a high around the world. Europe looked up to the US for leadership now, and the Americans were all too quick to take advantage of the situation. After all, it was all about making certain people rich, and another exclusive rich boys club was starting up. In the 1950s, with Russia being an authoritarian communist power and China newly embracing communism in their own form, the West now had a new enemy: the communists. The war in Korea was the first test of the US as leaders of the free world, and they got their butts handed to them by the North Koreans and their buddies, the PRC. The US military was still tired from World War II in 1950 when the North Koreans decided to cross the 38th parallel in June. That and the generals made a series of huge tactical mistakes based on hubris, which got over 23,000 American soldiers killed for nearly nothing. Don't get me wrong, pushing back against the communists was a good thing, but they kind of went about it the wrong way and a lot of soldiers got killed. 3 long years later, the West negotiated a ceasefire that's still in effect to this day. No one was defeated. They just agreed to disagree, and they're still there doing that today, which is why the U.S. military has bases and posts everywhere in the immediate area. South Korea, the famous Camp Casey, and elsewhere, the Navy and Marines in Okinawa, and the huge military presence on mainland Japan. I spent a lot of time in the 1970s in all these places except Okinawa. The stalemate in Korea didn't stop the Americans, though. Their NATO colonist buddy, the French, got themselves in trouble with the communists in Indochina, what we call Vietnam now. They had been abusing the indigenous peoples for decades, and now these oppressed peoples were fighting back against their oppressors. Who did they call? Their NATO allies, the Americans. The United States was more than happy to sell arms to the French and send some special forces advisors, for a cost, of course. What are French for, right? As usual, defense contractors in the early 1960s saw an opportunity once again: the South Vietnamese armies. They bribed certain American politicians and the wallets were open. Of course, now the U.S. needed to be more engaged, so they started sending more troops over, little by little at first, to help the South Vietnamese fight off the communists in the North. Some say that this was the way for the military to get redemption for what happened in Korea a decade before, and others looked at it as a way to start purging the world of communists. Either way, by the late 1960s, a lot of corporations were getting filthy rich with new defense contracts, and a lot of GIs were getting killed over ideologies and puffed up chests in Washington. The U.S. gave up over 55,000 lives because of the propaganda that communism had to be wiped out like a disease before it infected the Western world. By 1974, Tricky Dick Nixon was in trouble again, for good this time. After cheating his way to the White House and prolonging the war, he finally got caught along with his cronies. How many lives would have been saved if the voters had been able to see what a criminal he was back in 1968? Nothing has changed for the hapless Americans since the first religious refugees came ashore in 1609. They still remain intensely tribal to this day, and are upset now that they're starting to lose their grip at the top spot of the world's biggest hill. They don't like losing anything after decades of murdering and cheating the rest of the world to gain that coveted spot as king of the hill. Make no mistake, the US is very much guilty of assassinations, cheating countries out of wealth, staging and enabling coups for regime changes more favorable for their interests through the years since World War II. Now all that is starting to unravel as other countries are now standing up and flipping off the mighty US and cozying up to their rivals, the Russians and the Chinese, especially the Chinese within the last couple of decades. This new BRICS alliance is starting to gain momentum and memberships as the alliance is promising better trade deals using their own currencies, which is being backed up by gold reserves instead of US dollars. I learned that the world's central banks are buying up every ounce of gold they can get their hands on and stockpiling it as a hedge against the US dollar and collateral for their own currency. As I mentioned, the less developed and sanctioned countries are circumventing the Americans by buying gold bullion and some thumbing their nose at the US. So let's play a game of what if. What if the Native Americans had met the Puritans on the beaches of Massachusetts and Virginia and wiped them out before they could even set up their first fortifications? No Jamestown or Plymouth Rock. What if they had killed all the French voyageurs when they had arrived in North America? Maybe even the Spaniards. How would that have changed the course of history for North America? Well, I don't think it would have changed things too much other than delaying the inevitable, but delayed nonetheless. The word in Europe was already out about the New World. The greedy European precursors to corporations were already salivating over plundering the vastness of the new continent. In the late 16th and early 17th century, they had no idea how vast North America was yet. Just a hint from the French voyageurs who had been there and reported what they had found. What if the Native Americans under Tecumseh had been able to rally in large enough numbers to defeat the English militias and stop the westward expansion? Imagine what would happen if George Washington had gotten killed during the French and Indian War. What would North America look like now? A nice theory, but given how Europeans were not adverse to using germ warfare, the indigenous peoples didn't stand much of a chance. Whole villages and tribes were wiped out due to the deliberately induced European diseases that the natives had no immunities to, like smallpox. This is how the Europeans and their descendants fight. No rules except what it takes to defeat the enemy. Nothing is off the table. Something Americans have never forgotten to this day. What if Truman had said, "We don't have enough resources to push back the North Koreans. We'll just help the South out as best we can," never sending the 24th Infantry from Japan to repel the invaders? What if he had listened to MacArthur and nuked the North Koreans? What if Nixon had been caught in 1968 and charged with treason for going behind LBJ's back and circumventing the negotiations with the North Vietnamese? Hubert Humphrey would have been president, or even Johnson, as he may have decided to run again and win. The war would have ended, and a lot of soldiers would have lived on both sides that didn't. If the Democrats had won in 1968, things would have played out a lot differently in the 1970s. No Nixon or Agnew resignations, no Gerald Ford for a few days, and Jimmy Carter might have actually had a chance to accomplish something good. What if Jimmy Carter had won instead of Ronald Reagan in 1980? Would South America look like it does now? Would the U.S. be a lot further down the road to renewable energy now? All these are very good possibilities. Look where the United States is now, trying to bully China because they want to trade with Russia. The U.S. government is afraid that China and North Korea are supplying Russia with arms for the war in Ukraine. We know that North Korea is, as they will sell anyone to be used, sell to anyone to be used against the West, especially the U.S., and their rockets are being found on the battlefield in Ukraine. Russia is trying to do more business with China to get around the sanctions, which is working somewhat. Same goes for India, although those deals are soured over money. They don't want to use American dollars, and both want their currency to be used. So much for cooperation. But it looks like they're working out their differences through this BRICS alliance that the U.S. and the West are not allowed to be part of. The US is threatening the largest banks in China with sanctions if they handle Russian trade deals. So the banks are backing off and Chinese factories are left holding the bag as Russians can't find a way to pay them for their goods. Once again, the US wants to rule the world. What if China could prove that they are only trading in consumer goods and manufacturing materials not used for military equipment? China is trying to be a good trade partner with the West and the US, but the US politicians are convinced that China is a bad guy nation and want everyone to stop doing business with them. Of course, this all means that they want everybody to do business with the US. I mean, that's what it really means. So, mostly, this is about competition on the global markets. China is now the world's manufacturing powerhouse. The US gave that up when they drafted NAFTA and put it into law, outperforming the US by leaps and bounds with this new manufacturing prowess. And this is really making American businesses angry. And my whole theory about this is, why did you do NAFTA in the first place? And now here you are complaining about it. It's your fault, here, American business. Get over it. The US is so full of BS these days in their quest to remain as top dog in the world. American politicians lie, cheat, and steal to become president. Remember how Ronald Reagan won the election in 1980? Look at how George W. cheated his way into the White House in 2000 and had his Republican sycophants stuff ballot boxes for him in 2004, some of whom even got caught, but no one made a big stink about it at the time. During Georgie's reign of terror, we had Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, CIA black sites, the Patriot Act, the just newly extended FISA Act, and so many other abuses of power in his 8 years and going forward. So many dead and wounded on his watch that didn't need to be. All for power for him and his cadre. So I'm going to take a break right now. I'm going to leave you to think about that. I'll be back in a couple of minutes and I'm going to bring you up to speed on what's going on right now. During this couple-minute break, I have a couple of things I wish to bring to your attention. First, I want to take a minute to introduce MBR Radio and WAA Radio. So MBR Radio stands for Military Broadcast Radio, and WAA Radio is Reese Across America Radio. These are veteran-run radio stations in the U.S. Both of these companies are nonprofits and only use the proceeds to help veterans in need. If you're a veteran or still on active duty and are watching or listening to this, check these stations out, as there are a lot of veterans contributing to topics ranging from military service to politics and everything in between. Well, search for MBR Radio on YouTube or on Twitch and Rumble, or WAA Radio on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and TuneIn to support veterans with their patronage and support. So now to switch gears. To let you know, this podcast will remain free to subscribe to on all the major mobile podcast apps, on my YouTube channel, Krana Biha, and for the first 30 days on my Substack page, kranabiha@substack.com. With that in mind, I want to ask for a donation of any amount to help me keep this podcast and website going. I would rather solicit donations instead of charging subscriptions, so everyone has an opportunity to watch and listen to this podcast. I'm asking for help defraying the cost to produce this podcast and maintain my website. I've set up a donation tab on the Village Oak Tree webpage at rss.com and a donation page on my website at www.kranabiha.com, linked to PayPal for your security. This way there's no credit card info shade anywhere, and you can use any currency you wish around the world, providing PayPal is available to you. No amount's too small. Now, to find my website, the easiest way is just to copy it from the background behind me if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to an audio version, take the website name from the podcast logo shown. Either way, search for it and enjoy your visit. And I'm also trying to still sell some copies of my book, which can be found at any book retailers around the world. You can also buy from me direct in the bookstore page on my website. Fugitives in the New United States is available in hardcover, paperback, and ebook form. Free if you're a Kindle subscriber. It's written for young adults and older, so it's safe for teenagers and adults. If this were a movie, it would be rated PG. Look for Fugitives in the United States at your favorite book retailer and enjoy. Thank you for your patronage and support. Now back to the show. Welcome back. In current affairs today, the U.S. has started to get kicked out of Africa for abusing its welcome. The current administration is caught between a rock and a hard place that their predecessors got them in trouble with Israel. Of course, the president told the world right after October 7th, 2023, that he was a Zionist and the U.S. would stand with Israel with no conditions as they defended themselves from Hamas. Look at what that misguided declaration has gotten him: complicit in genocide, condemnation from little countries that are standing up to the West, especially the U.S. Now, authoritarian crackdowns on peaceful college protesters exercising their First Amendment rights to protest against their government policies. The authoritarians are justifying calling in the military police. I say military police because they're militarized police because they're afraid of the students. They want things to be normal, as if there's nothing going on in Gaza. No camping out on campus property is their reason for arresting the students. Anyone old enough like me who remembers the violent protests of the Vietnam War days knows that this is total BS. It's just another excuse to make the students go away and stop bringing bad publicity to the schools, as this unrest may affect enrollments and donor money. Bottom line, it's all about the money, stupid. Students are a lot smarter than the older generations give them credit for, and it's showing once again, just like during the Vietnam War protests from the days of their parents and grandparents. They know BS when they hear it, and they're calling it out. Now things are going to get ugly, as the militarized police will start becoming more violent as they follow the orders of the politicians over them. And this is coming all the way from the Speaker of the House. He's wanting the police to go in there and crack heads. The crackdown on the students is just getting started, and there will be some dead and wounded before it's all over. Wait and see. Mostly because the establishment can't stand to lose face over this, as it would mean a loss of money and maybe some jobs. It's better in American culture, at least in the viewpoint of the older generations, to look like strongman putting down a violent protest than someone who allows students who aren't supposed to know anything to upset the status quo. Biden's in trouble and he knows it, but he can't extricate himself from the morass he has found himself in. He's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, and he desperately needs to win this next election, which is not looking good right now unless he can pull a rabbit out of his proverbial magic hat before the end of the summer. He wanted to sanction an extreme IDF military battalion over human rights abuses going back to long before October 7th to send a message to Israel and Netanyahu. But that backfired as this State Department backed down over the posturing of Netanyahu and his underlings. The only reason that the U.S. would back down from the Israelis is because the Israelis have what the Russians call compromat on the U.S. and some of its leaders and threaten to make it public. How much do you want to bet it's all the above? Israel would have direct knowledge of any war crimes that the U.S. committed in the name of conducting the war on terrorism in the last 20 some years. They also would have incriminating evidence to use against individual political figures that would upset the proverbial apple cart in Washington if certain personal details became public. So, of course, the U.S. backed down for the moment. You can bet they're trying to figure out a way to get around all that before they make another move to stop Israel from finishing their genocide and ethnic cleansing. Pretty sad when the U.S., who is supposed to be the bastion of freedom around the world, is once again showing the world their true colors. Hypocrites. The United States is not a democracy or a republic. Never has been. I have an excellent article by a Jewish writer named Richard Lowenthal, who wrote something about this a day or so ago. He writes that the U.S. has always been a divided, polarized country bent on individual freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want, with no one telling them no. They largely accomplished that for a handful of decades now. But he states that this has always been the way of the colonists and the fledgling Americans as the main driving force as they continued their westward expansion, despite all the hardships and deaths that incurred. Death by misadventure in the frontier was still better than being held down in abject poverty with very little rights or individual freedoms. This mentality is still a driving force for the disenfranchised average working class American. They rebelled against the ruling class when they voted for Donald Trump back in 2016, and they will try to do it again in this coming November. The average American wants their individual freedoms back, and a large percentage of them are prepared to commit violence against their rich landholder masters to get it, which they think are the Democrats, due to all the misinformation being floated around. What they fail to understand is that they lost a lot of those freedoms when Ronnie Reagan became president and started taking those prized freedoms away. This erosion of individual freedoms has been going on for a long time in the short history of the United States. It was give and take throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But by the 21st century, the rich elitists have won, and they are now trying to take what's left. This is neither a Democrat nor a Republican Party mess. This mess belongs to the voters who were conned into voting for these charlatans in the first place, and now they're reaping what they have sown. I don't have an answer for this situation that the U.S. finds itself in. Biden can't fix this by himself, and the Democrats are too busy standing on the sidelines laughing at the dysfunctional Republicans to be of much help. The Republicans are so polarized within their tribe because of Donald Trump, they can barely get out of their own way most days now. Too many Democrats are standing on the line with Israel and are complicating things with Biden in his attempts to rein in Netanyahu and his Likud party. This is the same scenario that the American people have repeated throughout most of their sordid history. So much tribal infighting that they become unable to manage anything, so they break down into smaller tribal units, fighting amongst themselves over their individual freedoms and not for the greater good of the nation. Although they did manage to make it to the top of the world's hill by hitting, killing, and cheating their way to the top in the last few decades. This pursuit of individualism will be their death knell soon if they can't figure out a way to overcome their differences and their tribalism. Not that other countries don't suffer from this malady, but the U.S. seems to have an overabundance of this pursuit for personal individualism ingrained in our DNA ever since the first colonists showed up on the run from persecution. Think about this as I wrap this up. England was famous for sending its petty criminals to their roughest colonies to work off their sentences. Australia is the most famous of these old English penal colonies. How many of you know that Prince Edward Island in the Canadian Maritimes was one such penal colony? I've got some ancestors that came from there. How many of you know that what we now know as the United States also had certain places that were designated as penal colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries before the United States was a nation? England shipped out a lot of criminals to their colonies all over the world back in the day. How many listeners to this can trace their ancestors back to a deported criminal from the UK dating to before the American Revolutionary War? How many criminals were sent to the Americas even after the Revolution? How many descendants would they have today? Do criminal traits pass down through the generations? Could this have something to do with why American politicians behave so badly towards other countries and each other? I will say this last thing before I go today. I don't believe all Americans are descended from England's deported criminals. A lot of good-hearted people came from all over the world to the Americas to find a better life than what they had. Maybe for religious persecution where they were running from. Maybe political persecution from a bad authoritarian government. A lot of them arrived and found the same persecutions they had left behind. My own Irish immigrant ancestors being a part of that. Whatever the reason your ancestors came to North America, don't fall for the trap of fighting the American dream that is being held out like a carrot on a stick. Nowadays, the myth of the American dream is just that, a myth. Land and a house are fast becoming just a dream for a large percentage of people. Jobs that pay a living wage are moving farther away from the average person's grasp. More and more people are becoming homeless, even though they have jobs. Let the students who are protesting the war in Gaza lead by example. Jewish students are sitting in with Palestinian students to peacefully protest the same thing and are being arrested along with them. Why can't the elected leaders show the same solidarity and make Israel stand down? Then the students will return to their classes and all will be right for a little while once again till something else comes up. So that's all I've got for you today. I appreciate you tuning in. As I said, next week, I plan to have this interview with a very controversial young man from Los Angeles, and I hope you'll tune in. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and I hope you have a good week. Seanchaí. Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you'll return again next week for another episode of the Village Oak Tree. This is Seanchaí. I hope you will continue to let me come to your village to bring you some news from the outside world that might make you think a wee bit. Please share this podcast with your friends and relations. The more you share, the more we can convince enough people to make the world a better place to live in. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as you go about your day. May your blessings outnumber the shamrocks that grow. May trouble avoid you wherever you go. Slán go fóill.